Back at it, man. How we doing?
Indeed. Good, man.
Yeah.
Good. Ready to tackle this. This is close to heart since I just ran. So this will be a good one.
Yeah. We were talking a lot about, for everyone that is listening or watching, whether you're on YouTube, whether you're on Spotify, we wanted to make a podcast that you can come back to and can be a strong point of reference. It's geared for account executives, but I think this would absolutely pay dividends to SDRs, brand new SDRs breaking in. We're going to talk about the ways to really optimize the first 6 months as an account executive. Whether you're brand new to the AE role or maybe you're making a job change and trying to come in and hit the ground running. These are the things that we have done ourselves that have helped us, and also, looking at some of the things that maybe haven't as well. Lastly, Chris and I, want to thank you all for the support. We've been growing quite a lot. We're getting hit up by a ton of brands. So just so everyone knows, we've actually turned ads off on YouTube, and also we are not accepting any sponsorships at this time. So the way we do what we do is through higherlevels.com. No worries if you're not in a position, not looking for external training, but we do have communities for people breaking in. We have communities for top performing SDRs at AWS, Okta, Snowflake, Rubrik, some really great companies. And also coming up in about a month, we're going to have a public launch of our AE Mastery course and community as well. So Chris, with that being said, I'll kick it over to you, maybe set the stage for us.
Yeah. So we've got a good little laundry list here of things. So the general theme of today, and we talked about this quite a bit, is just like what you should be focused on when you're ramping into a new sales role. And honestly, a lot of these themes that we're going to be talking about today, they're applicable regardless of whether you're an SDR, whether you're breaking into tech sales for the first time, whether you're an AE. Really this applies to just about any sales role, to be quite honest with you. But we're going to start off talking about identifying who the real top performers are. So like getting an idea of like who you should even be focused on, who you should be learning from, who you should be looking at to emulate. The second one is just figuring out what they're actually doing to be successful. So if you just walk up to somebody and ask them like, hey, what are you doing to be successful? They're not going to tell you. So we're going to talk a little bit about like how to actually build that knowledge and where to actually find those sources to actually shortcut that path to success, shortcut that path to getting like a good workflow in place. Yeah. Third one, not getting lost in enablement, right? Like just like watching training videos, it's very easy to get lost in the sauce there for like 3 months. And then before you know it, you have zero ops, nothing on the table. So that's obviously a whole topic in of itself. This is one that you're going to talk about a lot, building an internal brand. Yeah. So I know you have a ton on that. And then last, account planning. That's a big one. Like where should you spend your time? You have this new account set of 400 accounts, 500 accounts, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more. Where do you spend your time? How do you pull the best reports? XYZ. Yeah. Maybe let's start with the first one. It's just like, this is pinnacle of success for me. Is like before I even go out and I start listening to enablement, before I start going through all the product training, the first thing I'm trying to figure out is like who are the top performing sales reps, right? Who can I find internally that is crushing it to where I can just quite literally copy what they're doing to a certain extent, make it my own, and get into a workflow of hitting my number. Yeah. I'll throw it over to you. I'd be curious just to get your take on this. Like how do you typically look for top performers? I obviously have a lot on it too, but
yeah, I think for me, the big thing like coming in right out of the gate. So I know at least at my company we have, and I know every company has some form of this, like a win wire, usually in Slack. So I'll be checking deals there. There's a few, not just seeing like who has closed deals recently, but you'll tend to notice too with like reps that are really hot. If you go into the actual comments of the win itself, people will be like, yet another one, or like, man, Chris is staying hot. He's closing so much this quarter. Like that's going to give me a good sense. I'm also, with the manager that I would report to, a lot of times, obviously would ask them straight up, like, hey, who are people I should emulate? Who are people I should listen to? And then not like I'm going to take that answer and go immediately and say like, hey, like manager, Bob said I should talk to you, like, what's up, right? And well, I'm sure we'll break that down. But I'm going to try and quickly, like at the large size of the organization I work at now, I'm going to try and whittle it down to maybe 10 to 15 people where I can then go into, as an example, Gong, and like start listening to calls and then see whose style I gravitate towards, see if within that pool of people I can see like if there's people that stand out immediately as to like, oh, I get it. Like I can see why this girl or guy is like doing really well, then I'm going to listen to a couple more calls. And like, that's how at least I'm going to plant the seeds. I don't want to jump the gun to like the rest of it, but that's really kind of like my order of operations first. You have a lot of data at your disposal. And I think, don't get single threaded through your manager, like start to get a sense, make a friend or two. If you're at a big company and they hire multiple new AEs at the same time, kind of try and find one or two buddies that you can trade notes with, and then very quickly start to like close the gap from day one to finding out who the top performers are. But curious your thoughts.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's pretty much, it's really not rocket science, right? But I think a lot of the times, honestly, like what seems like a top performer at a first glance could be very deceitful in a way, because I mean, we've all heard of like the saying like territory, timing and talent. And so like there is something to that.
Yeah.
And so the first thing that I'm doing, to be honest, is I want to validate whether or not that success is coming from their own output or their own input, or whether it's just like maybe if you are segmented, if you're covering like the West Coast or if they're covering the West Coast, which is typically a pretty hot territory, maybe you got like some shitty territory, like you want to identify very quickly, like, okay, is this rep crushing it because they're actually doing something out of the ordinary, or are they getting 65% more inbound than everybody else?
Yeah.
That's my first thing that I'm trying to figure out, is like, sure, they can be at the top of the leaderboard, but where does that success really come from? And it kind of ties into the second point, right? Is like figuring out what the top performers are doing. So obviously the first thing I'll be doing is going to the dashboard, looking at like, hey, who are the top performers? Cool. Now I'm going to go in and maybe take like one person at a time. To your point, I go into Gong. I listen to like 15 of their calls, if not more. I literally walk through like a majority of their calls throughout that quarter. I look at their closed lost. I look at their closed won. I want to see like, what are they doing when things get tough? And what are they doing when things are going well?
Yeah.
From there, I'm just writing down like, hey, what questions are being asked by prospects, right? Like this is a good learning experience across all levers. This is why I push so much for, not going through enablement. Like enablement isn't all bad. So like if you're an enablement person out there, I'm sorry.
Buckle up.
Yeah, this is a generalization. But I think it comes back to like a lot of the times enablement has gotten a really bad rep because a lot of enablement people have never sold a day in their lives.
Yeah.
And so you are essentially basing the start of your tenure at this company on a hypothesis of like, this person thinks this is what you should be doing to be successful. But in reality, that's very rarely the case. I mean, I don't think that's ever been the case for me, quite honestly. And I will say like the enablement at my company is actually really good. Like we have people in enablement that have been active sellers, which that makes such a big difference. Right? I know I'm jumping around here a lot, but it just comes down to like, you got to surround yourself with the best. You got to figure out whether or not they actually are the best because they're doing things out of the ordinary, and then copy those things, put them into your workflow, take notes, listen. You got to study them, right? I mean, that's really like the gist of the entire episode, is like where you find your inspiration from, how you note it down, be structured. Don't just like go into every single call and then be like, okay, I listened to it.
Yeah.
Great. I get it. Awesome. I'm ready to go. Like actually take the time to structure. What are they doing? What questions are they asking? How are they structuring their discovery calls? How are they leading them through the sales cycle, right? How are they dealing with objections? Like all of those things, I sat down, I completely neglected enablement to a large degree. Like I obviously went through it, and I'm so sorry if somebody from Anta is watching this. There is some good stuff in there, but honestly, like I would urge anybody to not just go through enablement, but to actually supplement it with real life scenarios. I think that is the perfect combination, not just to be in a vacuum, watching videos, reading books or whatever else. That's never how you learn.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, totally. And I think like it's interesting because one, like this week we had a new rep that I kind of met with and helped guide in the right direction. They're doing great. And I think it's funny. Yeah, you get caught up in all of these different terms, these industry terms, product terms, how it drove a 30%, increase, return on investment in 1 month and all this stuff, right? And that's great. But at the most fundamental sales level, like you don't necessarily know the questions to ask, how to guide a conversation, how to make a prospect kind of trap themselves into the value points of your product. And like that is a consistent gap I see with enablement as well, because it's just tough. Like if you're not taking those calls, if you're not taking at least, minimum one of those calls a day, but ideally, I'm in a position where I'm doing a lot more of those. Like it's just really hard to take that and then have like an actual practical guide of how to lead a call end to end. And like for everyone watching or listening as well, it's like one of the things that you taught me and I started playing around a lot more with is the Gong AI feature. So for everyone working at a company that has Gong, you can go go to call recordings and it's got like a little AI tab that I think it says like ask me anything. And I'll, you taught me this, but it's like literally go in and like say, hey, provide me condense all of the questions and answers that were asked in this. And I might ask it maybe as a first prompt, like, hey, list out all of the questions that were asked in this conversation. Boom, right away. Yep. You've gotten a lot of them. And sure, there's going to be some that are like, could you clarify that? And like, you can ignore those, right? Yeah. But, it's like that, doing that to like 10 different calls, you can very quickly not only get a list, but then compare and contrast without having to listen to a 30-minute call 10 times and then having to use your own memory to be like, I think it was this, I think it was this. And then also, just not to be glanced over for account executives out there. I think this is obvious if you're an SDR. But like when I first came into my role, now that I've been at for almost 2 years, one of the first things I did was go into outreach and cherry pick the SDR cadences that were working well. It doesn't mean I use them like copy paste, but I think like, when it comes to messaging, it's like, it's really tempting to like go to your peer and say like, hey, what messaging are you using? And sure, maybe if they're a top performer, they have good stuff, but if they're really good, they're not going to give it to you. Yeah. But objectively, like there is so much data that I feel a lot of reps don't take advantage of, that you can come in and right away at least say like, maybe I don't use this one for one, but out of all of these, 10 major cadences our SDR team is using, this first email in this cadence had a 34% open rate. This second email in a different cadence had a 54% open rate. And now I'm going to cobble those two together because the SDRs are so deep in their workflow, they're not taking a chance to like step back and actually analyze that. So I think there's so many things you can do. Again, not that it's like the golden ticket, but it just puts you like so far ahead of where you otherwise would take 3 to 4 months to get through trial and error, and you're already starting at a much higher bar than I feel like people who are just like feel a lot of pressure to just like feel like they know it from day one. Yeah. It's like you will never have a better chance the first month in your role to really dive deep, have little to no expectation of delivering a huge result, and like that is the time to get lost in all the things that you have at your disposal, because it only gets harder when you get into the day-to-day workflow of like running 4 deals in one day. You've got 4 different calls with 4 different customers. Are you really going to actually have some deep work for an hour and get into all these different things? But I digress.
No. Yeah. That's the whole essence of the episode. I think it's just where you should be putting your time, because it is extremely valuable time. Like so many people just decide, oh, I'm ramping. I'm just gonna like chill and watch videos and like watch Netflix and clean the house, and like that's cool, but like on the back side of that, you've now kind of wasted that precious time where you should be doing that upfront work, and you're gonna have to catch up on the back end of like listening to gone calls like after work hours, right? Like when you're fully ramped, when you're taking those 4 to 5 calls like you're referencing as well. So I think getting lost in enablement is a huge thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with enablement. You just got to judge it, right? You have to make a qualified decision of like, hey, this stuff right here, one, is it being taught from somebody who actually has formal sales experience, right? Like, has this person actually sold before? And 2, even better, if they actually have sold before, have they done it at the specific company? If that's the case, then I would actually highly urge you to go through that training, because that is what you're looking for. You're looking for training or emulation from somebody who has actively been crushing it or has had a success or track record of crushing it. I think to your point as well, it also comes down to playing into the strengths, right? This is where looking and analyzing like CRM data analytics inside of outreach is extremely important, because if you just go to the top performer and you're like, hey, this person is 160% to their number, I'm just going to copy every single thing that they do, that's not necessarily going to be, a recipe for success. Yep. Maybe there's one little lever that they're doing really well that's unique to their territory, that's unique to something as part of their book of business. Yeah. And if you apply that same lever or that same strategy, that might not work for you. So that's why you really got to get deep in the trenches. Like you got to get really good at outreach, and it's not rocket science. Like it's actually really simple. Like it took me like a weekend to sit down. It was a full weekend of going through like analytics inside of outreach. But now I literally have a tight pulse on every single top performer. I can look at every single deal. I can look at all the communication. I can look at every single step of their sales cycle to identify what's actually driving the success in this. If I see a pattern of this rep doing this in every single deal that they close, well, I'm probably going to go ahead and emulate that, right? Yeah. But if I don't go into like the trenches and look at every single little step of their sales cycle, I could take something that isn't even applicable to me and apply it, and it's not going to do anything for me. Yeah. So, and same thing with like the SDR example, right? Yeah. If you maybe you're emulating somebody who doesn't do any outbounding at all because they have so much inbound.
Yeah.
Well, if you go look at their sequences, they're probably dog shit.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and it's going to be a waste of your time. But if you go to the SDRs who are deep in the trenches and you kind of Frankenstein things together, make it your own, that's the recipe for success, right? Like you identify this person is really good at driving up ACV. Cool. I'm going to take some of that, right? This person is really good at closing really quick. I'm going to take some of that, right? And those are like, that's how you actually become a really strong seller. It's not by reinventing the wheel and being like this crazy magician on sales calls like that. That's not it. You know, honestly, it's more about not sounding like a salesperson and taking these little things and implementing them into your sales cycle.
Yeah.
So
no, it's funny. I saw a LinkedIn post right before we started recording that was like, if I was going to be a top performer today, here's the 4 things I would do. And one of them was literally like, get creative. Like most reps are sending like emails and all this, but like, have you considered like LinkedIn voice messages and all this? And it's like, I'm not outright disagreeing with that as a prospecting tactic. But again, I think especially for the person that's a first time AE or especially SDR, it's like, I don't want to call out this person specifically, but they're not even in tech sales anymore. But like we had this SDR that like, one of the first weeks they joined, they wanted to recreate, if you've ever seen the PayPal picture with Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, when he's got that horrible hairline before he got the hair transplant, like he was going to recreate that and like shave his head and like do like a thumbs up by an old PC and like Photoshop our company's logo on the screen. And I was like, dude, like that's like commitment. First of all, that's kind of hilarious, and I love the thought and the effort that you want to put into this, but like let's get the basics first. Like that, like the whole purpose in my mind is you want to be able to get 80 to 100% quota attainment, whether you're an SDR or AE, like as quickly as possible, and don't reinvent the wheel. Then from there, if you're doing that, you get that systematized work that we talk about on the pod and in our community on higherlevels.com. Like when you systematize your work, and now that 40 to 60 hour of grunt work that you've done these first 6 months becomes 30 to 40. Now that extra 10 to 20, if you want to put that work in and overachieve, can be these more creative endeavors, or just quite frankly, applying your system on even a broader scale. But yeah, I totally agree. It's like people want to reinvent the wheel. It's like understand how a wheel is made. And then you can consider reinventing it, So
No. And that's a huge mistake. I see that happening all the time is like, people want to prove that they're hot shit when they come into like a company, and and not just that, but also like not making things scalable. They start putting these really unrealistic expectations for themselves that like, I did this too, to be quite honest with you. It's like, instead of focusing on writing the perfect follow-up email, just get the email out there. The prospect doesn't give a shit, like to some degree, sure they do, but you noting down every single little thing and spending 45 minutes, like I shit you not, like there's reps that are spending that much time on follow-up emails per prospect. Instead of doing that, maybe try to think a little bit more about like sustainable things, right? Because realistically, once you have a full book of business and you're managing like 15 deals a month, like you're not going to be able to take 45 minutes per deal to write out a follow-up email between all the shit that you're doing of like, drafting up proposals, running discovery calls, demos, trials, POC. Like, it's unrealistic, right? So I think it just comes down to exactly your point of, one, create a baseline for yourself before you start thinking about all these creative ways to do shit, right? Like, actually get into a rhythm of like, okay, I have this workflow. I know it's going to get me to, even if it's just 80% or 75%, right? You now have a system that you can follow that doesn't involve guesswork, that doesn't involve you having to like jump through 10 different hoops to even get remotely close to hitting your number. Once you have that baseline, now you can start experimenting. Now you can start strategizing. And coincidentally, honestly, for me, I don't do a whole lot of experimenting. I actually let other people do it for me, because I always have a pulse, right? Like this thing that you're doing when you're first ramping, it doesn't stop, right? I think that's honestly the common thing that I see across a lot of top performers, especially in today's age with all the AI and all the tools that we have at our disposal, is they have this constant pulse on what's working. So I don't have to go out and guess my way to like, oh, what should I do now? If I see a rep and I go through like their outreach history of like, where are these opportunities coming from? They might not even realize that the majority of their opportunities are coming from maybe event attendees. But I can see that pattern before they do. And what's going to happen? I'm going to go in and exhaust that list. I'm going to get all the credit. I'm going to look like a magician, right? So that's like, you want to look at trends, not just like guess based on nothing, right? You look at those trends, you identify them, and based on that, you start doing stuff.
And my last comment on that, because this is a great combo, I could definitely go deeper. It's like, I think especially early on in your career, I feel like at least myself, knowing a heavily technical product served me very well. And I think I over-indexed on that. And the further I got into it, I realized, yeah, to your point, and maybe something we break down further with account planning and some other things we have on the agenda, is like the quality of the data that you're actually working with almost starts to trump your ability at a certain point. So it's like, again, speaking to enablement, it's like, sure, like learn all the stuff. And aside from enablement, being questionable at certain companies, like, sure, great, you know the product, and that entire month you were like, I'm going to go super deep and learn everything about databases. Well, you've missed the only time you're going to have a chance to go super, super deep into trying to find like the gaps in data that the average rep is not even thinking about or taking the time, because they're so busy and inundated now because they're a year and a half into their role, they've got a good workflow, and they're more resistant to change than you are coming in with fresh eyes. So
yeah, you almost have to take like a manager's eye in a way. Like you have to look at it like you're trying to get a lay of the land. You're just trying to analyze what's going on internally, right? Anyway, let's segue into the next one. This is a topic that you talk about a lot and that you have a lot of experience with. You've obviously had like a crazy track record of just like moving up super quick. You were like an SDR for like
3.5 months.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. And a lot of that, like obviously you got to be in the right time or in the right spot, but you also got to like do the right things. Like you executed really elegantly, and you sure, like there were opportunities that presented themselves, but you put yourself in that opportunity, right?
Yeah.
So maybe just break that down. Like how would you build your internal brand if you're coming into an organization starting off? Like what are the key things that you're looking at? Where should you spend your time? Where should you not spend your time?
Yeah. And no perfect answer, obviously. I would say like a few of the things that stand out. And it's not the sole reason for some of the success that I've had. Like I don't want to overblow that either. I'm not like the world's best sales rep. However, I do think like a few different moments stand out in different roles. Like for instance, when I was an SDR, my third day ever as an SDR, we had a company-wide competition because we were launching a new product. So they gave a new deck to all of the SDRs like a week prior. Basically the first day I started, and then actually the week prior, the reps got a brand new deck from the product and marketing team. And they were like, okay, a week from now, we're going to have all the SDRs pitch this and give like, I don't know, a $100, $200 gift card to the best SDR. And so on my third day, like I could tell like everyone kept talking about it. The SDR manager kept talking about it. And to your point, I executed very well. It wasn't like I came in and was like, look at all these details that I know, but I had benefited from previously being a support engineer. I had to communicate a lot of these high level technical concepts before. And I put in a ton of work to actually really, really understand the product more so than most, to the points we talked about previously. And I got second place out of all of our SDRs the third day on the job. And I literally we had to present in front of not only my sales manager, but the VP of sales. All of the enterprise team, or at least most of them, were actually on the call as judges as well. And if you get a moment like that, whether it's, as an SDR, some type of presentation, certainly at the account executive level, QBRs, and I can talk about that example as well. But really, you don't have to do a ton here. There's a lot more early on if you try to project that you're trying really hard, that can harm you and maybe isolate you, if nothing else.
Yeah.
As opposed to like less is more early on, trying to come in and to oversimplify, just like be humble, be learning, and there's right and wrong ways to approach people and try and learn. But I think it's like, less is more early on from a projection standpoint and to trying to network. There's no need to try and do that perfect day one, but it's like really those first 2 or 3 opportunities you have where you're in front of a bigger portion of the company or a team outside of your direct team of, call it 5 to 10 people. That's where I think you've got to put a lot of time. And again, we can talk about how to execute well, but if you're thinking about for instance, a good counterexample to this is I'll be on a team meeting and my second week on the job, everyone's talking about outbound messaging, what's working for you. And then your manager says, hey, why don't we all try something new? And next week we'll talk about what's working. I, in a past life, would try really hard and be okay, in reality, my manager kind of made that Friday afternoon comment off the cuff and let's see what we get. Mm-hmm. And that's really about the thought that they put into it, because at the end of the day, especially as an account executive, outbound messaging is great, but hitting our number is the number one North Star, right?
Yeah.
And so I will see a lot of reps that are early on, they're kind of twiddling their thumbs and they're like, oh, perfect, I could actually win this informal competition, and you spend a week like sending garbage messages and just grabbing any and every lead as opposed to like approaching your territory more strategically, and you show up to that meeting a week later and the manager like forgets that they even had that call to action the previous week and no one even talks about their outbound messaging. So that's all I'd say is like, you know, less is generally more early on, and like when there's quote unquote a formal opportunity to display, again, you don't have to come across as like the number one. You don't have to be the funny guy. You don't have to be the guy who has all the punchlines or all the perfect things to say. But showing up and doing something at a very high level is a very strong, like puts people on notice. And I think just sets yourself up as like, if nothing else, like high potential. So people are going to take you a lot more serious. I've got another example, but I'll pause there.
No. I think that's good. And I think it just comes down to like, I think the bulk of your time, like the majority of your time should be on performance, right? Because we are in performance-based roles. You can sound like a champ, right? Like you can sound amazing on a team call or like on an all hands or whatever else. But if you're not hitting your number or performing, nobody's going to take you seriously.
Yeah.
Like honestly, I see so many reps that say the dumbest shit, to be quite honest with you. But they are hitting 180% to their number, right? Yeah. And that's a whole other conversation. But it's like, anything that they say, or even people on LinkedIn, right? Like LinkedIn sales influencers, like they might be, and we talk about this all the time. So like, you know, I'm sure they all hate me. But it's like, if you're selling at a hot startup where you have so much inbound, you have a hot territory, you can say anything under the sun and you sound smart because everybody's going to think, hey, that's why he's so successful, right? And so like coincidentally on the other side, there can be somebody who is not hitting their number at all and might have something really intelligent to say, actually something that would crush, but nobody's going to take you seriously. Nobody's going to listen to you. So even like the prerequisite, and you were in a good position because you were crushing it. You were doing really well, right? And so it's like an amplifier of like, okay, this is somebody who's doing really well. He's obviously a killer. Like he doesn't just talk a lot of shit. Like he comes to the table, and every single time that he comes to the table, he's got something valuable to say. Yeah. Right? Like that's how you're taken seriously, not like coming to the team call like, yeah, guys, so I actually just put together this sequence for you all and it's been working. Like, no, you know, like, absolutely not. Like that is like, if somebody does that, dude, like anyway, sorry. Just don't do that. I'm not even going to get started on that. So it's obviously like a whole topic, but I think, you know, spend the time wisely. Like if there is a big incentive like that where you have exposure to like higher management or leadership, then obviously it makes sense, right? Because those are the people that you're trying to impress. If you're coming in hot like that, like, that's how you do it. But don't come to your team meetings, like your one-on-ones, trying to be the hero. That's actually a really bad way to like, or a really good way actually, to get a bunch of extra responsibility that you don't want, right? The moment that you start talking about like creating all these cool sequences, you just took on like probably like an extra 3-5 hours a week of responsibility for no reason. Right?
They connect you with sales enablement. They connect you with marketing. They do all that stuff.
It's amazing. You're gonna, if you love that, cool. Right? Like anyway, I'll be curious. Like you said, you have another example. I'll throw it over to you, and then we can jump over to maybe like some CRM planning and low-hanging fruit. Yeah,
for sure. And I think like some of this, if you've been an account executive for a while, is maybe just a refresher back to basics. But I think, you know, a real example, and I don't talk too much about my current job and the ins and outs, but I will say when I joined, at the end of my first month was a QBR, and it was on site. They flew everyone together, and my manager, probably the best manager I've ever had, was like super intense. Like she didn't mess around, and really had like a strict line of business. And you could tell, like, one, I very much enjoy that like leadership style anyway, but two, it was one of those things where it's like you could tell over time, if you put in the work, you can earn trust and not have as much of a lens on it. But I could tell, like, coming into this QBR, my performance was going to be like very critical, right? Like if I showed up and it was like a mediocre one, it wouldn't be good, it wouldn't be bad, but I could tell that if I came in and did a very strong job, it would set me apart in their eyes to be in a position, and that's how it's played out. But all that to say, you know, let's take the example. I gave the one in the presentation, but I know a QBR is a more universal thing that I can speak to that every rep is going to have. And so for me, it was really showing up and going in depth of like with all the information that I had, which wasn't a ton. But again, I was turning away the extracurricular meetings. I was not attending the company culture meeting or, I don't know, like taco cooking class, which is fun.
Those
it's
are the
fun.
best, man. That's where you become a top performer right there.
Yeah. And, it's like, those are the kinds of things I had to sacrifice to get an extra hour to put into these QBRs.
Yeah.
And when I showed up, among many other things, they gave me a template and I did exactly what they asked. To your point of like showing up with sequences and doing all this, I didn't come to the table and say, hey, I saw that template you guys gave, and in addition, at my last company, we did this in X, Y, and Z. Going back to not reinventing the wheel. I did exactly what they asked in an extreme amount of depth. Mm-hmm. And two, with the information I had, being a month into the role, they're not expecting me necessarily to have be the number one rep by the end of my first full quarter at the company. So I think it's just like being very real, and the fact that I had as much information as I had at the time to not only organize my territory, run the right reports, and as crazy as this sounds, like the basic shit of like when I'm doing forecasts and I'm taking screenshots of Clary or Salesforce, actually having the numbers add up when I say this is my total pipeline, this is my commit. Like, it's amazing how many reps I'll see that those little typos get there. You have these screenshots on one hand and you're off by like $150,000, and it's like,
yeah,
like what are you doing? Yeah. But anyway, all that to say, some of this is basics, but like every deal that was active that I inherited, I had already made a point to have a call with that customer or prospect to make sure that I at least had a pulse of what's going on. I could come to the meeting and say I've already spoken with them. I could speak to the technical use case and say, hey, this is why it's valuable on a technical level, but also just backing up at the most business level, like, sure, that's important on the technical side, but this is why it's going to matter, and this is why this deal literally makes sense for this quarter, this upcoming quarter. And so some of those are basics, but I think, again, it's just an illustrative example because, throughout my time here, I've been fortunate and things have gone well, but because I did very well, along the way, people depart, people leave for different reasons, and then when different opportunities and accounts opened up, because I performed very well in that QBR, I've gotten some good opportunities, and my peers have as well. But I think, again, it's like, if that hadn't happened, my name's not even on that list when certain opportunities become available. Like within 6 to 9 months after that QBR, there were times where reps were inheriting other deals, and there were deals that no way when I first joined the company I would have ever thought within a year I'd be aligned to that account, and here we are. So, maybe an illustrative example, but I think it's just really important.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's extremely important because it's like those are some of the things that other people don't see, especially if you have been both a top performer, maybe like a mediocre performer, like you've kind of gone between the two, you actually start to identify like you get like it's an amplifier. Like success is an amplifier for everything, right? Like you'll see the best reps will get the most autonomy, will get the highest responsibility deals because people trust them, right? Like if you're a proven killer, if you have the highest win rate, if you have the highest competitive win rate, well, guess what? Who do you think your CEO, if you're like a 200-person company, is going to want to give the high priority deals to? The person with the highest win rate, right? And so like that is how you earn the respect, is you come to the table, you perform, you crush it, and it is an amplifier, right?
And I was going to say, if I could add one more thing too, I think even maybe this is too low level tactical, but I think, again, in a situation like that where it's your first big presentation or your first big QBR, like compartmentalizing and truly accepting that there is not a huge expectation that it's going to be incredible. The flip side of this is like, don't use that as a cop-out, because I've seen this younger in my career. I made this mistake. I've seen this from other reps. If you say, oh, like, yeah, I know I'm a month in, so like with all the information I have, this is my best guess. And like from, I watched this, and so my approach to this would be this, but what do you guys think? And like, again, I do think like, I don't want to get too deep into this and like pull me out if I'm getting too deep in the weeds. But like even with these first opportunities, I think I would rather have someone who is like confident and composed, not overconfident, but confident and composed, versus someone who I can tell is like trying to make sure they don't mess up more than trying to win that presentation or that QBR or whatever they're doing, if that makes sense. I just want to add that because I feel like a lot of people are like, oh, great, like the expectation's not there. And then they'll show up and say like, what do you guys think? And then like, yeah, I talked to this client. How would you handle this situation? It's like, I don't know. That's why I hired you. Why don't you tell me what your plan is? You know? So I just want to throw that in.
I mean, I actually had a really good conversation with my current boss, who I think is a killer. And we were going through this, and it was kind of like I found myself in that trap of like actually asking that question. I was still doing the right things, but I was asking that question of like, hey, what are, what are other people doing to get to this result? And that's important, right? Like we've actually spent a significant amount of time throughout this conversation identifying why that's important, how to actually find those elements. But if you come to the table and you start telling your leadership that you're doing all these different things and just trying to like be a copycat, it's not good. Like it's a balance, right? Like literally corporate life is this entire like game in a way. Like it's actually just game theory, like in a box. And so you got to be like very mindful, right? But he said something really impactful to me. It was like, I didn't hire you to be like everybody else. I hired you to do something different, right? Because I thought that you could change things and you could bring a breath of fresh air. Now, you don't take that and you start getting super creative, right? Again, everything that we talked about is super, super important there. But the expectation is over time that you come to the table and act just like you did, right? And the way that you're explaining it, that you are composed, I think that's the perfect word for it. You're not a bullshitter. You're not just like, the worst thing you can do is just like standing up there and trying to explain away like XYZ, like not like saying a lot, but not really saying anything at all.
Yeah.
Right. That's the worst thing that you could possibly do, especially if you have executive leadership in the room. Be direct. The number one thing that executive leaders appreciate is directness.
Yep.
No bullshit, no fluff. Yeah. Anyway, let's move over to the next one because that's like a whole conversation in itself. So I think maybe just giving people like some actionable advice on like low hanging fruit. Like there's a couple of different like reports, different segments that you can just touch in like every single company essentially, right? Like we talk about close lost a lot. That's probably been like overshared every single place. But I mean, quite literally, like those are people who express enough interest to open up an opportunity internally. There's obviously a lot of bullshit in there too. Like it's not just good stuff. But that's a great list to go into, right? And I actually use the close loss report. I look at the top performers and I don't just look at the closed loss. I also look at the closed won. But honestly, going through other people's closed loss is super valuable because if you're only looking at closed won, I mean, there's a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes that reps know nothing about. Like, I think I read this study by Gartner, and obviously, like these studies are very vague, but I do think that there's a lot of like truth to it. Is that the average person in SaaS that comes to the table or prospect, they're already like 75% of the way throughout the buyer's journey. So they know a ton about your product already. Right? They might have already been waiting to buy. They might have already like told themselves like, hey, we're going to buy this. We're going to go through the sales cycle just to maybe try to get a better deal. Right? And so like going through close loss, you get to actually experience, hey, how are sales reps actually performing when things get hard, when things are tough, when there's objections involved? That's where you really learn, to be quite honest with you, because you can't live in this fantasy world. Like what's an average win rate, right? Like, I mean, across like the entire tech sales space, maybe like 15, 20%. Right? So it's like, if you only look at that subset of those, that's not like the reality. Right? But if you look at like the broader picture and look at the commonalities of like, hey, this rep is doing XYZ in this situation, they're a top performer, they're not getting too much inbound. I honestly would look at that as a proxy for success. So anyway, just getting back to the point of like reporting is super important, not just for yourself to go in and like look at these specific previous opportunities, but for instance, like if I'm inheriting a territory, I would look at like how that rep has run that previous sales cycle, especially if it's a top performer, right? You can learn these different things by going a step deeper, not just putting them into a sequence and like dropping them into some generic stuff. Actually take the time to go through that list and make it educational for you as well, right? One, you're going to build a bunch of pipeline through that, probably like the most valuable pipe that you're going to have. And second, you're going to learn a ton. So that's mostly applicable to like ramping. But even if you are an existing AE, I see so many AEs with horrible like habits of doing things, and they've been AEs for like 5 years and they're still just doing it because they're getting by, they're a good company, like they're getting enough inbound, they can afford to make mistakes in a way. But yeah, I think close loss is definitely my number one. I'll throw it over to you to see like what other low-hanging fruit that you can think of.
Like some of the ones that come to mind are like any free trial downloads, not only just recently, but even you might find a gem like a year or two old that someone started a trial with good intentions, got distracted, budget froze, layoffs, whatever it might be, and now they're like, actually, we were going to do that. This would be a good time to re-engage. So obviously, free trial usage statistics, if you're at a company that's advanced enough to actually be able to let you see what users are doing, that's a great place that I log into. And I know there's some reporting tools for that as well. Also, obviously, kind of what we talk about in our SDR accelerator as well, in terms of not just any and every lead. Like I think creating leads by lead type whether it's attending a webinar. I'm sure your company has 10 different white papers and all of these different things, but over time, trying to identify which ones are a higher intent to buy than not. And then I know if this is a good transition, cut me off if there's more to say, but I also want to talk a little bit about territory planning as well, especially for account executives, because I think that's a big one to get tripped up because it's an endless ocean, especially if you're in like an SMB mid-market corporate level role or maybe enterprise one. There's in theory territories I've seen, some people have 300 accounts and we have someone in our AE Mastery early release course that has technically 8,000 accounts. Like, where do you even begin to organize your territory, right? And so if we're in a good position to segue, I'll speak to that. Yeah, I think one of the biggest things for me, especially your first quarter, is it's really tempting to try and get because it feels impressive. If you have a territory with 1,000 potential customers and you ran a list of 500 of those and you organize them, and you've got a little filter by company size, by revenue, and you can hit the little button on the top of the Excel sheet to organize them in that way. I mean, sure, but are you really going to have the chance to do deep, thorough work that even if it doesn't work your first quarter, you could fail enough to actually have some meaningful insights? So again, what I'm about to say is beneficial in a couple of different ways, but if nothing else, I think if you try and go after 1,000 companies and you think you're actually going to hit that list, one, you're not, but two, even if somehow you did, the quality of outreach is going to be so poor that it's probably not going to work. And you also didn't put that much thought into it after a while because you just tried to scale too fast. So you're not going to be able to actually learn anything meaningful of what worked and what didn't. And you're going to have no frame of reference to adjust and get better. So all that to say, making it short, it's I think the best thing you can do is whittle it down to about 30 companies. You can grow this over time if you prove to yourself that hitting 30 a quarter is reasonable. But by the time as an account executive, you get into a full workflow and you're 9, 12, 18 months into your role, realistically, what I found is you're going to hit about 30 to 50 accounts regularly per quarter of actual genuine outbound, maybe if that, I might add. And so what I like to do is have 10 kind of in this A category, and there's many reasons to do that, 10 as a B, 10 as a C. These can be existing customers that you can upsell if your territory allows that. Start with the low-hanging fruit. If you have the ability to upsell to existing customers, start there. Those are A accounts. And then over time, really make your best guess at an A, B, C category. And then as you kind of get the results of the inbound leads you have, you start to get a sense for, hey, maybe I'm an SMB account executive selling to companies with 50 to 500 employees. But I typically find that e-commerce companies that have about 100 to 300 employees are converting even more because they can move much faster, they have a lot of budget, and if they're profitable, especially, blah, 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 right? But if you've whittled it down to 30, you can recognize those trends because you actually tried and talked to customers and had meaningful conversations. And then the next quarter, you're in a position to say, hey, why don't I try, maybe not my whole list, but out of the 8,000 companies that are in my territory, what if I had 15 of them on this list that fit that profile of 100 to 300 person e-commerce companies growing very quickly, right? So I'll pause there, but that's a brief synopsis.
No, I think that's solid. I think honestly that probably concludes the episode. I think we've gone pretty
deep. Yeah.
I think that's great. We're probably going to dive deeper into that in the next lesson, but lots to uncover here. And so if you're looking to break into tech sales, if you're a brand new SDR, or if you're an AE just looking to be a better AE, become a top performer, get promoted, then I think there's a lot of good stuff here. And obviously, to your point as well, early on in the episode, if you want to be a better seller, again, we're doing this because we love it. We really enjoy this. This is our passion. Obviously, feel free to check out Higher Levels. We'd love to have you. And I think that concludes it. I don't know if you have any famous last words.
Just say if you're watching on YouTube, follow us on Spotify. If you're on Spotify, we do have a YouTube with video format of not just this podcast, but also many other deep dives and talking head videos, etc. So
100%.
Thanks, everybody.